Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. The demand to do the job rather than merely do your best expresses a psychological distinction that is easily mistaken for indifference. It appears to subordinate feeling to performance, intention to consequence, and personal struggle to an impersonal standard. Yet beneath its severity lies a fundamental truth about purposeful action. Reality does not respond directly to effort, sincerity, or emotional investment. It responds to causes. A task is completed only when the conditions necessary for its completion have been identified, organized, and enacted. The bridge stands or does not stand. The train arrives or does not arrive. The product works or does not work. Human intention may explain the path toward the result, but it cannot substitute for the result. This orientation does not necessarily deny empathy. Rather, it places empathy within a larger causal hierarchy. Empathy allows one person to perceive the experience, difficulty, aspiration, and limitation of another. Goal-directed action asks what must nevertheless occur for a purpose to be fulfilled. The tension emerges when understanding another person's experience becomes confused with exempting that person from the causal requirements of action. Empathy then ceases to be a means of developing competence and becomes a means of protecting status. It preserves how the person wishes to be regarded, rather than helping the person become capable of producing the required result. The dynamic becomes clearer through the concept of proximity. Psychological proximity is not merely nearness in physical space. It is the degree to which consciousness becomes immersed in the relevant conditions of a process. A person can be physically close to a task, yet psychologically distant from it. Just as one can be geographically distant from a purpose, yet sustain intimate cognitive and emotional contact with its requirements. Proximity describes the relationship between attention and causation, what the mind holds near enough to organize action. In work, one may generate proximity to at least 3 different objects. One may become proximate to one's feelings about the work, to one's status in relation to the work, or to the causal process by which the work must be accomplished. Feelings disclose one's internal condition. Status locates the self within a social field of judgment, comparison, recognition, and authority. Causal proximity brings attention to the materials, standards, operations, relationships, and temporal sequence necessary to produce the result. Psychological maturity does not require the elimination of feeling or status awareness. It requires that both be integrated under the governing authority of causal purpose. This movement toward causal proximity develops through the four major stages of human life: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and mature adulthood. Each stage recognizes the relational field through which the individual encounters the four lessons of life: appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty. These lessons are not merely difficulties imposed upon life from the outside. They are the existential conditions that compel integration. Appetite reveals that life requires material. Vulnerability reveals that life requires relationship. Fragility reveals that life depends upon effective action within limits. Uncertainty reveals that life must project itself into a future it cannot completely possess. These four lessons correspond to Aristotle's four causes. Appetite directs consciousness toward the material cause, what is required for something to exist or be sustained. Vulnerability directs consciousness toward the formal cause, what kind of organization, identity, or relationship gives the material a coherent form. Fragility directs consciousness toward the efficient cause. What action, agency, or process brings the form into actuality? Uncertainty directs consciousness toward the final cause. What end organizes action across time? Each developmental stage foregrounds one of these causal dimensions, while progressively incorporating the causes mastered in earlier stages. The result is not a linear passage in which one lesson is left behind when another begins. Development is recursive. Every stage contains appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty, just as every purposeful action contains material, formal, efficient, and final causation. What changes is the scale, complexity, and degree of self-direction with which these elements are integrated. The child experiences them primarily through bodily dependence. The adolescent encounters them through identity and social differentiation. The adult confronts them through productive agency and reciprocal exchange. The mature adult integrates them through leadership, stewardship, and the transmission of value across generations. Childhood begins with appetite. Before the child can formulate a purpose, compare social status, or understand the meaning of work, the child encounters the world through need, hunger, discomfort, fatigue, warmth, touch, movement, and protection establish the earliest structure of attention. Appetite announces that life is not self-sufficient in isolation. It must acquire and integrate material, from the surrounding world. This is the first encounter with Aristotle's material cause. The child does not yet ask abstractly what things are made of or what resources an undertaking requires. The question is lived directly. What will satisfy this need? Food becomes proximate through hunger. The parent becomes proximate through protection. The body becomes proximate through sensation. The surrounding environment is not yet a neutral field of objects, but a field differentiated according to its capacity to nourish, regulate, threaten, comfort, or frustrate. The relational field initially performs the child's integration on the child's behalf. Hunger is followed by nourishment, distress by regulation, movement by protection, and expression by recognition. Through these recurring cycles, the child begins to associate differentiation with eventual reintegration. A need disrupts equilibrium. The child signals. Another person responds. The disturbance is reduced and continuity is restored. Attachment becomes the developmental organization of proximity because it teaches the child whether distance can be survived, whether need can be communicated, and whether disruption can culminate in repair. Empathy is indispensable at this stage. The child cannot yet fully identify, regulate, or articulate his own state. The caregiver must infer the meaning of the child's expression and translate it into effective action. Yet even here, empathy is not merely the sharing of feeling. The caregiver does not satisfy hunger by feeling hungry with the child. Empathy must identify the condition and mobilize the causal sequence necessary to resolve it. The child is fed, warmed, held, rested, or protected. Empathy becomes real through goal-directed care. The danger arises when care prevents the child from gradually participating in the process of fulfillment. The parent who perpetually anticipates every need, removes every obstacle, and completes every action may appear exceptionally empathetic. Yet, such care can obstruct the child's developing proximity to causation. The child remains near to satisfaction, but distant from the process by which satisfaction is produced. He experiences the result without acquiring the competence that connects appetite to fulfillment. Healthy development therefore requires a gradual transformation of proximity. The infant must remain physically and psychologically close to the caregiver because the caregiver supplies the missing integrative capacity. As motor control, perception, and memory develop, the child becomes capable of sustaining greater physical distance while preserving psychological continuity. Differentiation expands across space. The child reaches, crawls, walks, grasps, manipulates, and eventually acts independently. Proximity ceases to mean uninterrupted nearness and begins to mean confidence in one's capacity to restore connection and complete elementary cycles of action. The first developmental achievement is therefore not the abolition of appetite, but its organization. The child learns that need can become action, that action can produce a result, and that the world contains material capable of being transformed into value. What was initially performed by the relational field begins to be internalized as competence. Appetite becomes curiosity. Dependence becomes exploration. Care becomes the inherited basis for self-directed action. Adolescence shifts the center of development from bodily dependence to identity. The adolescent is no longer concerned only with obtaining what is needed, but with determining what kind of person he is becoming. The relational field expands beyond the family into friendship, rivalry, sexuality, education, culture, and social status. The central problem becomes not merely how to remain close to others, but how to remain oneself while entering increasingly complex relationships with them. Vulnerability becomes the dominant lesson because identity must be exposed in order to be formed. The adolescent must act before possessing complete self-knowledge. He must offer judgments, values, abilities, affections, and ambitions to a social world capable of accepting, rejecting, misunderstanding, or exploiting them. This exposure is not an accidental burden of development. It is the condition through which the self becomes differentiated. Vulnerability corresponds to the formal cause. Material alone does not determine identity. The adolescent inherits a body, a family, a language, a culture, and a range of capacities. But these materials do not yet answer the question of what form his life should take. He must discover the principles by which his traits, experiences, and choices can become an intelligible whole. He asks implicitly or explicitly, what kind of person am I? What relationships fit that identity? What values should organize my life? What pattern will give coherence to my emerging powers? At this stage, status becomes psychologically powerful because social responses appear to offer evidence about identity. Praise may feel like confirmation of form. Rejection may feel like the dissolution of form. The adolescent often confuses how he is regarded with what he is. Psychological proximity therefore shifts from the concrete presence of the caregiver to the symbolic presence of judgment. A peer's approval, a teacher's criticism, a group's acceptance, or a culture's image of success can occupy consciousness even when the relevant person or group is absent. Empathy remains necessary, but its function changes. The adolescent needs recognition of the difficulty of becoming differentiated without losing connection. He needs others who can understand his vulnerability without freezing him within it. Empathy must communicate that uncertainty about identity is intelligible while still requiring the adolescent to form judgments, accept consequences, and acquire competence. Protective empathy becomes especially dangerous here. When every correction is softened to preserve self-esteem, the adolescent may be prevented from distinguishing identity from status. He may learn that feeling judged is equivalent to being wronged, that effort deserves the same recognition as achievement, or that emotional discomfort invalidates an objective standard. The relational field then organizes itself around the preservation of appearance rather than the development of form. Developmental empathy does the opposite. It allows the adolescent's present condition to be seen without treating that condition as final. It says, in effect, your struggle is real, but it does not determine the standard. Your vulnerability deserves understanding, but it does not exempt you from formation. The teacher who identifies a student's confusion must still guide him toward knowledge. The parent who recognizes insecurity must still require honesty and responsibility. The mentor who understands inexperience must still expose the novice to standards that make growth possible. The demand to do the job begins to acquire moral importance during adolescence because it separates the person's identity from the immediate evaluation of his performance. A failed action need not mean a failed self. It means that the causal sequence has not yet been mastered. When criticism is interpreted as information rather than humiliation, correction becomes possible. The adolescent becomes psychologically proximate to the form required by the work instead of remaining preoccupied with the status implied by not yet possessing it. The developmental achievement of adolescence is therefore the ability to sustain vulnerability while forming an identity. The individual learns to remain open to relationship without allowing the relational field to dictate his essence. He becomes capable of approaching standards that initially expose inadequacy because he understands that inadequacy is not permanent identity, but a distance that competence can reduce. Adulthood brings the problem of efficient causation to the foreground. The adult is expected not merely to need, imagine, or define, but to produce. Purpose must enter the world through sustained action. One must build, repair, organize, negotiate, teach, protect, discover, raise children, maintain relationships, and create value for exchange. The central question becomes, what must I do to bring this intended form into actuality? Fragility is the corresponding lesson because action reveals the limits of both the actor and the object. Materials break, bodies tire, organizations fail, relationships deteriorate, markets shift, error accumulate, time is lost. Competence is never omnipotence. It is the disciplined capacity to act effectively with conditions that can resist, degrade, or collapse. Fragility is therefore not merely weakness. It is the recognition that value requires maintenance because the integrations upon which life depends are conditional. A machine functions only while its parts remain properly related. A business survives only while production, finance, demand, and leadership remain sufficiently coordinated. A marriage endures only while two individuals continue to sustain trust, attention, reciprocity, and shared purpose. The more complex the integration, the more numerous the points at which disintegration can begin. This is the domain of the efficient cause, the agent, force, mechanism or activity that produces change. Adulthood tests whether the individual can become such a cause. It asks whether purpose has been translated into procedural knowledge, whether values can be embodied in repeated action, and whether the person can sustain attention long enough to complete the cycle. The statement, "do the job," belongs most directly to this stage. It rejects the substitution of subjective effort for effective causation. "I did my best" reports the actor's internal estimate of exertion. "The job is done" reports a transformed state of reality. The distinction can sound merciless because it removes the self's emotional experience from the position of final authority. Yet adulthood requires precisely this decentering. The work is not primarily evidence of one's worth. It is an object governed by its own identity and causal requirements. The psychologically mature worker therefore moves closer to the process and farther from status preoccupation. Failure becomes data. Correction becomes calibration. Difficulty becomes a property to be understood. The person asks not, "What does this setback say about me?" but which cause was missing, misunderstood, or improperly enacted. The shift conserves psychological energy by reducing the layers of self-protection interposed between perception and action. Empathy has a vital but subordinate role within this productive field. A leader who ignores human experience may fail to understand some of the most important and efficient causes involved in the work. Fatigue, confusion, fear, resentment, inadequate training, conflicting incentives, and unclear authority can all impair performance. To disregard them is not objectivity, it is causal blindness. Yet the opposite error is equally destructive. When empathy is used to dissolve the standard of performance, it weakens the connection between action and consequence. The worker's emotional account replaces the objective account of the work. Sincerity becomes a substitute for skill, and struggle becomes a claim upon recognition independent of result. This protects status at the cost of agency. Integrated empathy diagnoses without falsifying. It asks why the task was not completed so that the missing integration can be identified. Was the material inadequate? Was the form unclear? Was the worker untrained? Was the method defective? Was the goal contradictory? Did the person lack attention, discipline, or commitment? Empathy contributes knowledge of the actor's condition, but causation determines what must change. Adulthood also requires the integration of the relational triad. The I-it relation allows the individual to engage objects, systems, procedures, and instruments according to their identity. The I-thou relation recognizes other people as conscious agents whose knowledge and purposes cannot be reduced to mere instruments. The I relation preserves the internal integrity through which one monitors motives, standards, and self-direction. Productive action fails when any one relation displaces the others. Pure I-it objectifies persons. Pure I-thou may allow interpersonal accommodation to override impersonal requirements. An isolated I can collapse into self-absorption. Mature work coordinates all three around purpose. The developmental achievement of adulthood is productive agency, the capacity to become an efficient cause while respecting the identities of the materials, persons, and purposes involved. Fragility no longer appears solely as a reason for protection. It becomes a reason for precision, maintenance, discipline, and care. Mature adulthood introduces a more expansive relation to time. The individual increasingly recognizes that no action is completed entirely within the present and that many of life's most important purposes extend beyond personal possession. Children become independent. Institutions outlast their founders. Knowledge passes to students. Cultural achievements enter traditions. The consequences of leadership unfold after the decisive actions have already been taken. Uncertainty becomes the governing lesson because the future cannot be directly perceived. It must be approached through projection, judgment, commitment, and trust in the causal continuity between present action and later consequence. Mature adulthood does not eliminate uncertainty. It develops the temporal staying power to act meaningfully despite it. This is the domain of Aristotle's final cause, the end for the sake of which an action is undertaken. The final cause does not operate as a future event reaching backward mechanically into the present. It operates through consciousness as an organizing purpose. The anticipated end determines which materials are relevant, which form should be constructed, and which efficient causes must be mobilized. Purpose integrates the entire causal field across time. At this stage, psychological proximity becomes increasingly teleological. The mature individual can feel close to consequences that remain temporally distant because he has developed the conceptual capacity to integrate long sequences of causation. He plants trees beneath whose shade he may never sit. He teaches principles whose fullest application he may never witness. He builds institutions designed to survive his personal authority. Proximity is no longer measured by immediate possession, but by the coherence with which present action serves an intelligible future. Empathy also becomes generative. The mature adult does not merely feel with another person or protect that person from difficulty. He seeks to understand what form of relation will help the other become a cause. The parent loosens control so the adult child can exercise judgment. The teacher permits the student to surpass him. The leader develops successors capable of acting without constant supervision. The mature form of empathy is therefore compatible with distance because its purpose is not perpetual dependence but differentiated continuity. This form of empathy understands that to remain indispensable to another person may satisfy one's own appetite for status, while obstructing the other's development. Generative care accepts the vulnerability of allowing separation, the fragility of permitting independent action, and the uncertainty of outcomes one can no longer control. It preserves relational continuity without demanding relational possession. Mature leadership consequently integrates firmness and understanding. It refuses to confuse compassion with the suspension of causality. Yet it recognizes that developing people is itself a causal task. The leader must identify not only whether the job was done, but whether the field in which work occurs produces increasingly capable agents. A system that achieves short-term output by exhausting judgment, initiative, and trust may fulfill an immediate purpose while disintegrating the human causes required for future achievement. Purpose must therefore be objectified without objectifying persons. To objectify purpose is to make the end definite enough that its requirements can be identified and measured. To objectify persons is to ignore their status as volitional, developmental beings and treat them as passive components. Mature adulthood distinguishes this. It respects the impersonal requirements of the task while recognizing that human beings participate in those requirements through understanding, choice, skill, and commitment. The final cause becomes fully developmental when the end sought includes the enlargement of causal agency. The best parent does not merely produce an obedient child, but an independent adult. The best teacher does not merely produce correct answers, but a mind capable of discovery. The best leader does not merely extract performance, but creates a field in which judgment, competence, and responsibility can expand. The relational field achieves its highest integration when proximity to purpose increases the self-direction of everyone participating in it. The progression from childhood to mature adulthood can be understood as an evolution of proximity. In childhood, proximity is primarily concrete and regulatory. The child must remain close to the sources of nourishment and protection while acquiring the motor competence to explore space. In adolescence, proximity becomes symbolic and relational. The individual must remain connected while differentiating identity from social judgment. In adulthood, proximity becomes causal and productive. Attention must inhabit the processes through which purposes are translated into results. In mature adulthood, proximity becomes teleological and generative. The person acts in relation to futures, institutions, and lives that extend beyond immediate possession. Each stage enlarges the scale of integration. Appetite first asks for nourishment, then for knowledge, then for productive opportunity, and finally for meaningful continuation. Vulnerability first concerns bodily dependence, then social exposure, then reciprocal commitment, and finally the willingness to entrust value to others. Fragility first appears as the body's need for protection, then as the instability of identity, then as the conditional nature of productive systems, and finally as the mortality of the self and the impermanence of institutions. Uncertainty first concerns whether the caregiver will return, then whether one will become someone's worthy of respect, then whether one's work will succeed, and finally, whether one's values will endure beyond one's control. The four causes likewise deepen recursively. Material cause develops from food and physical resources into knowledge, capital, inherited institutions, and cultural memory. Formal cause develops from bodily organization into identity, professional standards, social systems, and philosophical principles. Efficient cause develops from the caregiver's action into personal agency, coordinated production, leadership, and education. Final cause develops from immediate satisfaction into identity, purpose, legacy, and the renewal of civilization. No cycle of integration is absolutely final. Fulfillment does not terminate appetite, vulnerability, fragility, or uncertainty. It reorganizes them at a higher level. The completion of one purpose releases energy and capacity for another. The child who learns to walk acquires access to a larger environment. The adolescent who establishes an identity becomes capable of deeper commitment. The adult who masters a form of work becomes capable of leadership. The mature adult who transmits knowledge creates conditions for integrations he will not personally complete. Every fulfillment therefore generates a new distance. What has been achieved becomes the material cause of more complex purpose. The completed integration supplies resources, form, competence, and confidence, but it also reveals a broader horizon of possibility. A new appetite emerges because greater capacity can now perceive greater value. A new vulnerability emerges because entering a larger field requires renewed exposure. A new fragility emerges because more complex structures contain additional points of failure. A new uncertainty emerges because the purpose projects itself farther in time. This is why human development has the character of a spiral rather than a closed circle. The same existential lessons return, but the person encounters them with an expanded range of differentiation and a greater density of integration. The movement is not from need to the absence of need, from vulnerability to invulnerability, from fragility to indestructibility, or from uncertainty to omniscience. It is from passive exposure to active organization. The individual becomes increasingly capable of converting these conditions into occasions for purposeful causation. Empathy and goal-directed action are reconciled within this spiral. Empathy maintains proximity to the person. Purpose maintains proximity to the end. Causal reasoning maintains proximity to the process. Integration prevents any one proximity from displacing the others. Without empathy, the person may be sacrificed to the task. Without purpose, feeling may dissolve the standard. Without causation, both compassion and ambition remain ineffective. The deepest meaning of do the job is therefore not that human feeling is irrelevant. It is that feeling must enter a complete cycle of integration. Concern must become perception. Perception must become identification. Identification must become action. And action must culminate in a transformed state of reality. Empathy that never becomes causally productive remains sentiment. Purpose that disregards the human field through which it must be enacted becomes abstraction or domination. Mature action unites the two by asking what reality requires and what human development makes possible. The relational field is the medium through which this union is learned. At first, another person completes the cycle for us. Later, others evaluate the form we are becoming. Eventually, we coordinate with others to produce value. Finally, we become responsible for creating fields in which others can develop their own capacity for integration. Proximity evolves from dependence to differentiation, from differentiation to reciprocity, and from reciprocity to generativity. The ultimate fulfillment of development is therefore not the achievement of a static condition in which every need has been satisfied and every uncertainty removed. It is the acquisition of an integrative power, the ability to approach increasingly complex purposes without losing contact with reality, oneself, or others. The mature person can endure distance without experiencing abandonment, correction without experiencing annihilation, difficulty without interpreting it as injustice, and uncertainty without surrendering purpose. He does not measure his worth by whether the process always feels affirming. He measures the coherence of his action by whether it brings the intended value into existence. Yet he also understands that every human being begins at a different point of proximity to the process. His empathy allows him to recognize the distance. His reason identifies the causes. His leadership organizes the field. His purpose directs the movement. And the completion of one cycle becomes the material foundation from which the next fulfillment can begin. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.